Welcome everyone. I see it's coming in now. We've got a number of people joining. Thank you. I'll give a couple of minutes here for any latecomers to join us. Always good to see some familiar names here. Welcome everyone. All right. Maybe give it another minute. I hope everyone's doing well this Wednesday night. It's always interesting to find out where people are joining from. If you don't mind, like I'm in Toronto, Canada. If I can, the chat is open. If we can get a sense of where people are dialing in from, that'd be fantastic. Okay, very good. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight to discuss this, frankly, extremely important topic. So a bit of introductions here. My name is Jason Yim. I am one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus with over 15 years of consultative experience in dental and other industries. And it's my pleasure tonight to host this webinar for you to talk about 4 critical reasons. It's it's absolutely critical to have a properly structured dental office lease with yourself. And that's always an interesting one because when people think about leasing, they usually think about leasing from a major landlord with a grocery store anchor or perhaps in a retail strip or perhaps in a mall, in an office. One of the things that people typically don't think about is if they're buying a building or they own a building, you know, it may seem all hunky-dory, of course, because you are the landlord and ultimately you have a supreme amount of control over what happens with the space. But the lease becomes extremely important uh, when it comes to, frankly, your exposure to risk in the clinic, but also in terms of improving the value of the clinic at time of sale, include improving the value of the building at time of its sale, and also liability when it comes to having a potential like a tenant in your space. So I will launch a poll here if I can get a sense from everyone about where their situation is at. I'm happy to tune the conversation to cater to the current audience. So I will put the slide on screen now, the presentation. Let's get started here, guys. Okay. So I hope everyone can see this just fine. So again, as I said, this webinar is regarding 4 critical reasons why you should have a lease with yourself. And a quick round, with the poll questions, if anyone can answer those who don't have a lease today, I'd be very curious to see who doesn't have a lease today if they own a building. That's another topic we'll also talk about today. But the purpose of today's event is, of course, to do the following. What we'll do is we'll discuss some of the legal and financial importance of having a properly structured lease agreement between first of all, your building entity, a corporation that holds the building, that owns the building, and also their corporation that houses their dental practice, the DPC, the Dental Practice Corporation. On top of that, we will also identify some of the risks of not having this particular document in place, including certain tax implications. I'm not giving out accounting advice. I'm speaking solely from the perspective of the lease and its implications to eventual transition, but also as a landlord. Also, we'll be talking a bit about asset protection. Also, in terms of another topic we'll touch on is exploring the benefits of having a strong lease in regards to your eventual exit. Um, and then finally, what we'll also do is we'll discuss some best practices for creating or updating your own lease agreement, how it should be structured, things that you may want to include in your lease, or things that you may want to exclude from your lease that may be beneficial to you as a landlord. So a little bit about us at Cirrus Consulting. Um, we fill an interesting niche when it comes to the dental real estate world. So, for those that don't know, we've been around for 32 years. We need a little bit of update here, but it's been 32 years, and we've done over 13,000 healthcare leases. And when I say healthcare, the majority of our clientele is dentists. But we do occasionally service the odd GP or other physicians, optometrists, veterinarians even. A lot of their concerns are very similar to that of the dental community. And we got started because, candidly, it was a group of dentists out west that were, simply put, they were tired of being pushed around by their landlord. So they got together with some real estate professionals because the question mark that they had in their heads was, if they're negotiating a lease with their landlord, who can they rely on? Who can they lean on to have, to watch their back, to look out for their best interests? And typically, when it comes to either a lease negotiation or if you're looking to acquire a building, for that matter, there's usually two players in the mix. There's a real estate broker on one side, and the key thing with them is they're fantastic at finding spaces. They're fantastic when it comes to understanding real estate, when it comes to understanding rent comps, what rents should be like in an area. They may also have some knowledge of demographics information, what the projections are for a given area, how it's going to look in terms of growth. The problem has always been how they get paid. And for those that don't know, brokers typically will be paid a commission based on your purchase price or how much you're paying over a 10-year period on your lease. So the moment you sign that document that says, I'm buying a building or I'm going to be leasing a space, the broker is likely to get a commission of 4 to 6% of that. So that's part one. But part two, of course, is when it comes to the lease agreement itself, we find that most brokers, while they may be experts at finding the space, they may be experts at understanding real estate, they don't necessarily have the knowledge or the background to understand how the dental business interacts with that real estate. And that's where many doctors will talk to a lawyer. Perhaps their wills and estate lawyer, somebody that's helped set up their corporation, their M&A attorney, if they're looking to acquire a clinic that has real estate associated with it. And lawyers can be very useful in this regard. They have a good understanding of what's legal in a document. But the key thing is we always emphasize that it's important to work with people that are dental specific, that have as much information as possible when it comes to the real estate. When you're dealing with a lease, it's important to have all access to as much data as possible. And what we find is most lawyers, if you're dealing with an M&A lawyer that's helping you acquire a clinic, or a real estate lawyer that's helping you dot the I's and cross the T's when it comes to buying a building, they don't necessarily have the rent comps that the broker does. They don't necessarily have the demographic information that you may find very useful before you decide to buy a building. And that's where we fit in. We fit squarely right in the middle of the two. Again, we've done over 13,000 of these leases, both in terms of negotiations and also creation of leases. One of the neat pieces about us is because of our knowledge in negotiating leases, we have a clear understanding of what the landlord wants and what the landlord requires out of a space. And so we use that to our benefit when it comes to creating and structuring a lease that is to the benefit of the doctor. Also, we do have a in-house legal team, which can help with the business clauses and tuning the lease to be structured in a way that is, in terms of the business language, as favorable to the landlord, you potentially, as possible. And moving along, in terms of some of the other data that we're working with here, again, it's very important to have all the facts while deciding whether or not to want to acquire a building, and two, what the lease will look like. We use a commercial real estate software that tracks 95 billion square feet of real estate across North America. That includes Canada, US, Hawaii, and Alaska. In addition to that, some of the other information that we'd want to use to shape how your lease looks is the following. Now, take this with a grain of salt. We pulled this from the software, and it may not be reflective of your particular building, your particular area, but this is to give you a sense of some of the data that we'd be working with, that you should be working with when you're deciding things like how much rent you should be charging yourself, for example. You should also be utilizing this data in regards to determining, well, how much do you increase your rent over the next 5-10 years? It may not be sufficient to charge yourself one fixed rent amount. What we find is, according to this data, rent is increasing. There should be no surprise to anybody. But yes, rent does typically increase year on year. So in an effort to make your lease and your practice as attractive as possible, it's highly advisable to get the facts, to tune it to be in line with what the rest of the market is doing. Now, for those that may be wondering, this is always a huge question mark. If I own the building and I'm the landlord, why is it important to have a lease with myself? Why is this relevant? We get this question all the time. And frankly, we get this question a lot from dentists that they're thinking about buying a building, or they're already the owner of a building. The question comes up because, when it comes to our position here, one of the key things they ask is, well, I'm not negotiating with myself. Why do I need a lease to be put together? What's the importance of this document here? And there's a couple of key pieces here when it comes to this document. The first part certainly is the mitigation of risk to yourself as both the dental practitioner, the owner of the dental clinic, but also in terms of the landlord. A lot of this conversation will be heavily tuned toward those that own or are thinking to own a building, a property that will house a dental practice. So I would encourage everyone to put aside their dentist hat for a moment and also put on their landlord hat. What we want to do with this document is, if you have a dental practice in your building, we certainly want to have as much control over your asset. As the landlord, your asset certainly is the building. So that document that you would create needs to be tuned in a way to provide you with as much control as possible over your space and also your tenant, which is the dental practice. At the same time, that document will minimize any potential danger to you should something happen to, frankly, yourself, the practice, or the building. In addition to that, the lease is important because it will provide a separation of entities. And what I mean by that is it's very important to have, well, first of all, the DPC, the entity that houses the dental corporation, the dental practice. But the building itself, we find quite commonly that the building tends to be owned by one, the dental practice entity, the DPC, or two, we've run into situations quite frequently where the building is owned not by a separate entity, not by the dental clinic, but the individual personally. I recently ran into this where we had a dentist that was looking to sell their clinic, but they did not have a formal lease in place, and they own the building alongside their wife. And they've owned it. It's been set up that way for approximately 20 years. It's important to have that separation. Again, it's in regards to mitigating the risk, but in addition to that, having that separation allows you know, proper rental rates to be set up to avoid taxation issues, especially when it comes to selling the practice and selling the building. What we certainly don't want to run into is a situation where you have potentially a buyer at the table and they're looking to buy one but not the other. What are the implications of that in terms of capital gains? And again, in terms of your practice sale, having a lease structured properly with your end goals in mind is very critical here. One of the key things that your potential buyer will be looking for, either the buyer of the building or the buyer of the practice, what they'll be looking for is a properly structured lease, both in terms of the rental rates, in terms of the term, i.e., how long the tenant, the dental practice, will have in that space, how long they have, how much term they have to operate. Do they have options to renew? That's a critical piece that the banks will look at. And in addition to that, many of you will hold on to the building upon time of sale of the dental clinic. And at that point, you're the landlord over somebody else, a potential stranger, or it might even be a significant, a larger entity like a DSO. And it's very important to have an absolute amount of control, as much control over your asset, your new asset, which is solely the building, as possible. In addition to that, having a properly structured lease now provides you with a way to say your building is not just a building that houses a dental clinic. No, the lease will indicate that this building is an income producing property with cash flow and foreseeable revenue over X number of years, depending on the way you set it up. So when it comes to key factors of your lease agreement, there's a number to consider. Now, many people will think of a lease as a way to pay rent. And certainly it is. It will outline your rent and how much you charge your tenants. So it may be charging yourself that particular amount of rent, but it may be also charging your buyer with rents, both in terms of base rents, but also you need to consider annual increases, common area maintenance, any other kind of operating costs. These need to be factored into the creation of your lease agreement. Now, the key thing, of course, is I would pose this lease document as, let's not think about it just as a document in order to charge the correct amount of rent to your tenant, to your dental practice. It's much more so a business agreement between one business, which is the dental practice, and another business, which is your building. And if there's a business agreement to be had, there's a number of potential items that need to be put into the document to ensure that it is mutually beneficial to both in terms of the rental rates. Again, we want to make sure that we use the data to tune the rent to be exactly what you need it to be close to market, for example. But at the same time, we want to structure the rent to be friendly enough that it entices a potential tenant to stay in the space. We don't want a situation where we have somebody that buys a dental practice and you're the landlord. But if your lease is unfavorable in some way, it may induce the tenant, the new owner of the business, potentially leave. That would not be ideal for a landlord. So again, we want to structure the lease to be mutually beneficial in terms of the financial picture. But excuse me, also very importantly is all the legal clauses. The legal clauses being how much term does the tenant, the new owner of the clinic have in the space? How much time do you have in the space? In addition to that, what abilities do you, the tenant, or your potential buyer have to alter the space to make it to their liking? Do they have the ability to change the paints in the walls, or even take down a wall to add a new piece of equipment? Do they have the ability to renovate the space, to renovate your space? Do they have the ability to alter your space to their liking? Also quite significant will be, do they have the ability, does your buyer, your tenant, have the ability to sell their new asset, the asset they have purchased from you, the real estate, or excuse me, the dental practice? Key thing to note is how much control do you have over that? So this particular document will guide that conversation. Now, in terms of mitigating risk, the lease will provide you with a number of ways to do that. First of all, like I mentioned before, it's a separation of entities. It's the practice versus the property. We want to be sure that the practice has its own entity, it's separated by the lease, and the property has its own. And part of the reason for that is because of potential slips and falls and accidents. So what we run into in the Great North, of course, is certainly we see our fair share of snow and icy conditions. What can happen quite commonly is occasionally accidents happen on the property. If you have somebody that slips and falls on your driveway in your parking lot, the separation between the practice and the property will be very critical there, because one thing that the lease document does is it governs who maintains the property. And thus, whoever is maintaining the property potentially may be liable if there is a incident of that nature on the property. So having some separation there, if you have a corporation that has, let's say, minimal assets, talk to your accountant about this, of course, but if it has, as minimal assets as possible, it certainly will insulate you personally and the practice in case something like this were to occur. In addition to that, the lease document, just like when we discuss those that are leasing from a third party, so a major landlord, from a shopping center, the lease can either be detrimental to your Wilson estate and can leave your family exposed if something happens, or it can serve to insulate them and protect them as much as possible. One of the key things with the lease is when we look at lease agreements, they typically are binding to all successors and heirs. Meaning, if something were to happen to the the owner of the dental clinic, whether it be you or it be your buyer. In terms of that corporation, we would look towards the next in line in order to assume the responsibilities of the lease. Now, as a landlord, you can structure how this is laid out, i.e., from the landlord's perspective. If something were to happen to you as a landlord, we want to make sure that your family has as much control over the asset as possible. From the tenant's perspective, it's a little bit different, of course. There's items like death and disability that can be added into a document that can provide the tenant a way out of the lease. Now, from the landlord's perspective, that may or may not be ideal for you. So again, the key thing here is it provides either party, frankly, with protection in case something were to occur. On top of that, this document, in line with everything I just talked about, it's protecting some of your most valuable assets. It's protecting the dental practice, but also in terms of the property. One of the key things that I think about when I think about protecting the dental practice, if something were to occur, is we've had a scenario where there was a successful dentist that had 3 practices. They owned the real estate for all 3 of them. And what had happened was they had an unfortunate accident with a, let's say, aircraft. And unfortunately, they passed away. So, given that scenario, for the family, they were looking to sell their main asset, the practices, as quickly as possible. But because only one practice had a properly structured lease in place, it made it much more difficult to sell the other 2. And typically what happens is when it comes time to sell the clinic, statistically what we find is once you've listed a practice, if the practice doesn't sell within 90 to 120 days, it becomes exceedingly difficult to sell the clinic afterwards. Now, in terms of other structures in the lease, we certainly want to work on the financial pieces. We want to make sure that they are in line, your rents are in line with market as much as possible. You may be asking why. Why shouldn't I be able to charge myself as much as possible or as little as possible? Why is it important to keep the rents in line? Well, first of all, what we find happens is there's a tendency from our dentists to charge an arbitrary amount in terms of rent. I have found figures between $1,000 to $5,000 per month in terms of what people are charging. And when pressed, we find that the dentist may not be utilizing as much data as they could to tune this amount. The risk, of course, here is strongly, I could say, when it comes to that eventual exit. If you were to set a rental amount that is somehow not in line with market, either too low or too high, and there's an emergency exit, an emergency sale that needs to occur, there's a number of possibilities here. One, if you were to sell the clinic and the rents are exceedingly low, if they're lower than market, this certainly may be attractive for a buyer, but of course, that's unfavorable to a landlord. There's certainly we don't want to leave anything on the table when it could have been easily remedied prior. The converse is also just as detrimental. If you were to, for example, charge yourself what your mortgage payment is, that can be quite problematic because if that mortgage amount happens to be above market rent or significantly above market rent, there's a number of pieces here. One, if you have a potential buyer at the table that's looking to acquire your clinic, and the rents are much higher than the rest of the market, the incentives to stay in your particular building are lower. But in addition to that, if there's an emergency exit, i.e., if you're not there to reshape that lease, then what happens is if we have a buyer at the table and your rents are significantly higher, it suddenly becomes much less attractive to buy your practice. On top of that, what we want to emphasize is, especially if you're looking to uh, sell the building at time of sale, cash flow is going to be a key consideration here. So those that are looking to purchase the building, I would highly encourage you to look at how the cash, how the building will cash flow and how much rent you can meaningfully charge yourself as a tenant, or meaningfully charge your potential buyer. Um, that will be a key piece there. In addition to that, when it comes to the taxation piece, what we want to do is we want to make sure that if you're audited, that again, it's in line with what market is paying, that it doesn't arouse suspicion from the CRA. Now, in terms of tuning up that financial piece, that rent, one of the key things when it's come times to create the lease is, I can say, it's the structure of the rents, i.e., how are you going to charge yourself that rent? How are you going to charge your tenant that rent? Both in terms of base rent, is it going to be uh, you know based on the variable costs of the building? There's three main structures in order to charge rent. The first one would be gross rent. It's absolutely the simplest form. What we mean by gross is it's one fixed amount. For example, the rent may be fixed at $3,000, and it encompasses the water, the taxes, all the electrical, garbage disposal, etc. And for many building owners, that may be favorable to you, because one of the benefits here is it simplifies your accounting to to a great degree. But of course, there's certainly some trade-offs to any situation here. One of the trade-offs here is, of course, if you suddenly have a large repair, or if your water bill increases one year, there's really no ability to modify that for your tenant after the fact, once the lease is signed. So a nice blend between the first and the third option may be a modified gross, where you would charge yourself base rent, but depending on how much the dental practice is occupying the building, the dental practice may be charged only a certain amount of that. That will be proportional to that amount that they are occupying in the space. And then the third one, which is frankly, it's the most common lease type that we see. It's the triple net lease. And the way the triple net lease is structured is you still pay your base rent, but in addition to that, the other operating costs, such as your taxes, your maintenance, so your garbage disposal, your snow removal, etc., and any kind of building insurance, will be passed on to the tenant. Now, of course, it does complicate accounting a bit, but what we do find is that, frankly, this allows you to pass more expenses on to the tenant. So while it depends on your situation. If you're occupying the space right now, uh, this certainly has tax implications. If you can pass on more to the DPC, but on top of that, if you're going to be the landlord of your building, and if you're selling your practice, for many of you, this will be part of your retirement fund, and being able to charge your new tenant more will certainly be beneficial here. So in terms of other things to consider when we're tuning this lease document to be what you need it to be, what we want to do is we want to structure it in a way that is in line with your future projection for the practice and for the building. And we talk about dentistry as having a way in, of course, but this is much more so what's the way out and what's that going to look like. So the first piece of this is when it comes to your buyer, when they're looking at your lease, they're going to think about a couple of key things in that lease. The first part is, does your lease have sufficient term and options? Meaning, how long are they signing the lease for? How long do they have to stay in the space? They also will need to know, frankly, their bank especially will need to know, do they have the option to renew their lease? How does that look like? One of the key things that you can tune within this particular section is you may have set your base rent to be X number for the initial term, but the options may be a different story. You may want to revisit what the rent looks like if the tenant, i.e., your buyer, if they decide to stay and exercise the option to renew, the market may have changed over the last 5, 10 years. And you, as the landlord, you'll need to add in language here, which allows you to be to make it as flexible to you as possible, to be as favorable to you as possible when it comes to that time to renew the lease and determine what the rent will be for the next 5 years. So also when it comes to the eventual exit, that sale, a key thing to note is that most banks, especially in Canada, they are looking for 12 years of term. That is within the initial term of the lease, but also the options to renew. So, for example, if you have a 5-year term as the initial term, and there are 2 additional options to renew the lease for 5 years each, that is a total of 15 years of term, 5 years of guaranteed term, and 2 years of potential, or excuse me, 10 years of potential term available to that buyer. And that will be sufficient for the big banks as far as providing funding. I also should point out that the banks will be very cognizant of things like demolition clauses that may be found in a third-party lease. That's certainly the case. But for those that have greater ambitions for their building, for redevelopment, this is a very important piece to note. The most banks will be, let's say, not particularly happy if there is a demolition clause in the lease that is cutting into that term and options specifically, as most banks will need that amount of runway free and clear of any kind of demolition clause. They want to have the assurance that if they provide your buyer the loan, that your buyer will have sufficient runway to be able to practice and pay it off. Now, in terms of history of your lease, how long, well, let's put it this way, when should you start having a lease for yourself? That's always been a big question mark. How long should you have it? And long and the short of it is you really should have a lease as soon as possible if you don't have one already. And the reason for that is, well, first of all, in terms of the exposure to you in the practice and the building, we want to be able to minimize that by having a properly structured document. That's certainly part one. But part two of this is when it comes to that eventual exit, you having a properly structured lease in place for as long as possible with terms that potentially they may not have changed over the last 5, 10 years. In our opinion, it puts you in a position of power when it comes to negotiating the terms of that lease. at your eventual exit. If you have a buyer that comes in the picture and you present to them the lease that you've had for the last 8 to 10 years, and they can see that this is not something that you have quickly cobbled together at time of sale, there's much less to discuss. There's much less negotiation that can be had when it comes to that. That's something that we actually, when we're representing the buyer, um, what we do is we look at, how quickly, how long this lease has been put in place, because simply put, if the lease was put together quickly, and it seems like the landlord has, you know quickly put this together, and put together quick terms. In our opinion, a lot of these terms, if they've been put together quickly, they may be up for discussion, in terms of rents, in terms of some of the legal language that may be put in, the business clauses that may be put in. um, Having that properly structured lease in place for yourself, as long as possible, it plays a key role. Additionally, in terms of having properly structured rental rates, again, one of the big things is, at time of sale, the buyer will be looking at, and the bank will be looking at, cash flow. Having rental rates that are aligned with market will certainly help with that. Uh, what it'll indicate to your buyer is that they're not only buying a potentially successful practice, but they're also buying into a space that they can feel that they're getting a fair deal. And they, well, let's put it this way: you always get what you incentivize, and if you incentivize the lease to be favorable but fair, there's much less incentive for the new doctor to potentially leave or potentially renegotiate the lease. Also, the final piece here is the consent language. So, as I said previously, the lease can provide you or your estate with as much control as possible, or if it's poorly structured, it can provide your buyer with as much control as possible. So, through the business clauses of the lease, you can determine how much control they have in terms of what they can do in terms of alterations, what your buyer can do. We had a situation a few years ago where we had a dentist that wanted to expand within the space. They wanted to renovate, they wanted to tear down a wall. Uh, the language of the lease was somewhat vague as far as being able to alter the space. And what would happen was, unfortunately, for both the doctor and the landlord, was that the doctor had hired their, let's say, their family member to do the contracting work, and unfortunately they put a hole in a load bearing wall, so the roof eventually had a sag in it. That landlord was not pleased. Let's to put it mildly. So the reason I say this is, of course, it doesn't have to happen this way. This particular document will govern exactly what happens in that space, both in terms of what they can do in terms of altering the space, how they can operate out of that space, what they're responsible for in terms of expenses, but also maintenance. Uh, and in addition to that, you've sold the clinic potentially to this new entity that is your tenant. What's their ability to potentially sell? How much control do you have as the landlord over that transaction? How much control do you have over who operates out of your space? In addition to that, you can even tune the documents so that if you were to allow the consent, you can even control how much they're liable, how much the buyer, the person that is being assigned the lease, how much they're liable, both in terms of the one that is transferring the lease, selling the clinic, and also the one that's incoming. On top of that, in terms of what the lease can do for you, why it's important. You know, I touched on this a little bit earlier. In terms of that structure, in terms of that rental rate, that in terms of the data that you would use to tune that rental rate, this all has a bearing on how valuable your asset, the building, will be, especially at time of sale if you decide to sell the building. Again, one of the big pieces is, you know, we want to have a lease document to show your potential buyer of the building, to emphasize, look, I don't just have a building, I have an income producing property. I have a tenant in the space that is paying X number of dollars per month. And for any potential buyer of the building, what they'll see is not only will they be paying you whatever premium you want for the building, but for them, they're anticipating cash flow from this new asset that they would have recently acquired. Part of that cash flow piece, that assurance that the building will be cash flowing for the next number of years, is the length of the lease. How long is the lease term? This is a huge piece. I've seen recently that in terms of setting up that structure, what we find is 5 to 10 years is an average number. And what can happen sometimes is, depending on the situation, there may be a tendency to extend that initial term to 10, 15, even 20 years. I've seen as long as 25 years. Last year, I saw that. And this is quite important to note as well, because we want the lease to be as powerful for you as possible, and that includes flexibility. Having a lease that is structured so that the term is, let's say, 20 years in duration, what I can say is it does not provide you with that flexibility, because if there's a change in the market, for example, like what is happening right now, for instance, having a longer term does not allow you to simply change the rental rates. If you have a tenant in the space and they're 5 years into a 15-year lease, for example, you as a landlord, you don't quite have the ability to change what has already been written in. Whereas the flip side is also true. If you have a lease that is structured, for example, it's a 5-year lease, and the tenant is coming due for renewal. For example, if it's 1 year away from expiry, there's a very significant opportunity for you as a landlord to alter the rent to be more in line with market, or more in line with what you need it to be. So there's a lot to consider here when it comes to structuring the initial term, but also in terms of options. If you were to provide options to your potential buyer, it obviously provides them the ability to stay. But one of the key things to consider is, do you want them to have the ability to stay? Or are there some other plans for the building? This both applies to what we've seen in terms of third party leases. So for those that have leased from some of the major landlords within Canada, you know, demolition clauses are like commonplace nowadays. And if you as the landlord have an inkling of desire to sell to a developer, or develop yourself, for example, having your buyer, having your tenant have the ability to extend the lease and lock themselves into the space might not be the most favorable to you. So, in an effort to increase the value of the building at time of sale, wherever you're selling it to, these things need to be factored in. On top of that, in terms of other language that can go into a lease that needs to be considered when structuring a lease, I won't bore you to death with going through all the details, but these are among the dozens of items that we'd look to have in your lease to outline exactly how that business will be operating out of your space. Again, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but assignment, demolition, for those that have multi-tenanted buildings, this may be a consideration. Relocation. Do you have the ability to move the tenant from one space to another? For those that are selling a dental clinic or buying a dental clinic, having a relocation clause in a lease can be quite unfavorable. But for the landlord, it can be quite powerful. So, these are this amongst other items here, subordination, personal guarantees, overholding. What happens if your tenant will go month to month if they forget to renew their lease? What happens at that point? These are certainly things that need to be taken into consideration when you're looking to structure this document. So, in terms of other items that we'd want to look out for rather, when you're creating this document, we certainly want to work on focusing on who owns the building. This is something that you can ask yourselves today. Who owns the building? Is it you personally, or is it a corporation that you've created? If it is a corporation that you've created, is it your dental practice, or is it a separate holding corporation or otherwise that owns the building? Part two of this is, in terms of who owns the practice, we sometimes see that on the lease, the dentist would have signed the lease personally rather than the dental practice corporation. This has implications in terms of, at time of sale, capital gains, but also in terms of exposure, in terms of personal exposure. So very important to note when signing a lease or structuring a lease, who's going to be signing that lease. Another key consideration to think about for yourselves today is, are you paying yourself rent today? One of the big things that we always emphasize is, again, if you are paying yourself rent, which of course you should be, we want to make sure that it is in line with market as much as possible. And we're happy to help do an analysis of that for you. There's an offer at the end of the webinar. But on top of that, it's very important to note, especially if you're going to hang on to the building at time of sale, is how are you tracking your expenses? Your building expenses versus your office expenses. Who's paying for what? One of the key things that we run into when it comes to third-party leases is air conditioning. Who's paying for the air conditioning? Is it going to be the tenant, or is it going to be the big landlord? These are things that you can think about when structuring your own document, because again, when we're thinking about what's going to be fair to your potential buyer, they're also thinking about items like this. How much are they paying for when it comes to operating out of your space? On top of that, we want to look out for, well, simply put, do you have a lease in place today? And also, when you sell, do you actually plan to keep the building, or do you plan to sell together? The lease is absolutely important in this scenario because, well, first of all, for those that are looking to sell the building with the practice, one of the key considerations is, if you've got a successful practice that you're selling, and your potential buyer will be asked to pay upwards of 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million plus for your dental clinic, how much more would they have to spend to purchase your building? And as a result, will they be able to afford that? There's many scenarios where you sell the practice, your buyer cannot afford to purchase your building, at least not yet. So the structure of your lease today will govern, one, what your time as a potential landlord will look like, but also you can even tune it so that when your buyer of the dental clinic is finally ready, what's that potential sale of the building going to look like potentially to them? That can be tuned. That can be added into the lease. Um, and of course, like in an effort to uh, protect your assets and your family as much as possible, it's important to evaluate what's the state of your estate. Have you done wills and estate planning? Have you had something written out? These are all key pieces here. Now, also when it comes to that transition and, again, protecting that profit, protecting your asset, both the building and the dental practice. I touched on this earlier, but these are some of the key considerations here that we want to pay attention to. Again, we want to make sure that if your buyer decides to sell the dental clinic, what we want to do is we want to make sure that you, the landlord, have as much control over your asset, the building, as possible. And how this can look is you may make the final say as far as consenting to allow this new person to be in. But on top of that, you can control the conditions upon which your consent is granted. You can control who they're selling to. If they're going to be a tenant in your space, do they have the financial background, for example, to be able to carry the rent that you may be demanding, in addition to that practice loan? What are the rental rates going to look like over the next 5, 10 years, over the next 15 years, even? How's that aligned with market? Are you going to be keeping up with inflation? Um, we've seen this with larger landlords, to be clear, less so with doctors that own their own buildings, but this is something that certainly can be added into a lease. It's becoming more commonplace. It's consideration. And what I mean by that is if there's an assignment to be had, i.e., if they're asking permission from you, the landlord, what are you considering to say yes? Would there be any, for example, tying this to number 6, personal guarantees upon assigning the lease? Does the new tenant, does the new doctor have to sign a personal guarantee to ensure you that the rent will be paid? Or especially with the larger landlords, we've seen where the landlord may even ask for a portion of the proceeds of sale, uh, because, well, if you spent the time to build a dental clinic, you spent the time to train the staff, to make it a well-oiled machine, to keep the patients in the clinic, to set up your hygiene program, and you're demanding, X number of dollars for your clinic. A huge part of that demand of that asking price will be the space, will be the neighborhood that the building is in, will be the layout, it will be the beautiful windows, it will be the demographics of the area that the building is in. And for many landlords, this is a piece that they leverage to, frankly, the tenant's disadvantage. So this is a powerful one that you may want to tune to be what exactly you want it to be. On top of that, the surrender language. If your tenant, your buyer decides to leave, what's their obligation with the space? Do they need to return it to pre-dental condition, for example? What's that look like? Who owns what in the space as well? If they bolt some kind of fixture to the space, does that belong to you, the landlord, or does that belong to the dental practice? This can be tuned. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Death and disability. If something were to happen to that doctor, does their estate have the ability to exit your lease? This may be something that you may want to add in or withhold potentially. And then also all the other financial terms that come with the lease. So your common area maintenance, what the other expenses will look like, and everything else associated with that. Now, I hope this was beneficial. I know I covered a lot. We touched on a number of key pieces there when it comes to tuning this document. We do have a poll at for the end of this webinar. I highly encourage everyone to fill it out just to get a sense of one, what your situation is. Two, we always want to hear if this conversation was beneficial to you. And what I also want to add is that we do have a complimentary consultation associated with attending the webinar. I'm happy to take a look at your lease document today, whatever you've had put together for yourself, or if you haven't had one. Again, one of the big things that we want to emphasize is you really should use the data as much as possible to tune the document to be whatever you need it to be. And I'm happy to help look at some of that data for you and present that to you and formulate a strategy for you to make that lease, that all important lease, to put it together for you. It's totally complimentary. Please let me know if you're interested. But it's now 2 minutes over, and I want to thank everyone for joining the conversation today. I hope it was informative and beneficial. Please leave as much feedback as you can, and I wish you all a good night. Take care.